Hey everyone, it's Gary here from Echidna Sewing, and today I want to talk about thread, which is a subject I've been involved with for 40 years since I started in the industry. And most importantly, I want to talk about the topic of, can you use embroidery thread as a sewing or a seaming or a construction thread as opposed to a typical sewing thread. It's a topic that's getting quite a bit of groundswell at the moment, but to be honest, it has forever. I can remember back 30 or 40 years when people used to ask me the same question, particularly when embroidery machines first hit the home market back in the early 90s. You know, can you use embroidery thread as a seaming thread? Back then, the answer was pretty much unanimously no, because most of the embroidery thread back then was made from rayon, and rayon by nature is quite a weak thread. It has no tensile strength, and it didn't make a very good construction thread at all. As long as you use it in a decorative sense, it was okay, but not for constructing a garment or a quilt or patchworking or anything like that. You just wouldn't do it. But fast forward 10, 15 years, and polyester started to take over in the embroidery industry. And these days, polyester, or more to the point, Trilobal polyester embroidery thread, like Hemingworth, and there's a whole heap of other brands, good brands on the market, that has definitely become dominant. And so Trilobal polyester embroidery thread, what does it actually mean? Tri means three, lobal means sides. So it means that every way you look at this thread, it has this beautiful luster and sheen that actually outshines rayon, but you get the benefits of polyester. So polyester is a much more resilient fiber. It's color fast, and it's really strong. So it has some great tensile strength. So the temptation then is or the question is, do you want to use polyester embroidery thread as a sewing or a construction thread, or maybe more to the point, can you? Answer is yes, you can. You always have been able to. But it's whether you want that result, and that's what I want to talk about. So what would be the positives of using a polyester embroidery thread as a sewing thread, as opposed to the negatives? Now, the positives are that most of you will have a huge range of polyester embroidery thread in your embroidery stash, which means you are probably more likely going to be able to match a color. It'd be like taking this color here, this is a Hemingworth thread, and I've taken the cap off this and saying, wow, that'd be a really good match on that piece of fabric. And I'm going to show you a close-up on that in a minute using the polyester embroidery thread as opposed to, say, a spool of Resant sewing thread, and you will see what the results are. We'll come back to that in a minute. But what's the difference between a polyester embroidery thread and a polyester sewing thread? Typically, a polyester embroidery thread is made of filament, or a continuous filament yarn, and it has this amazing sheen and luster to it. Whereas a good quality sewing thread is going to be a spun thread. So this, for example, is Resant. I think Resant is the best sewing thread that money can buy. And this is what we call a polyester cotton core spun thread. So it means it has a polyester, usually a polyester filament center, and it's wrapped in a spun cotton. And that gives you just this amazing sewability on difficult fabrics, and particularly when you're on knit fabrics or synthetic knit fabrics, when static electricity on the needle builds up, and that causes, missed stitches and so on. Resant is without question the best thread to use. But there's another big fundamental difference. A spun thread is it's not as smooth and shiny as a polyester embroidery thread. It almost looks hairy, is probably the way to look at it. But the benefit of that is that it's like a really matte finish. And what you get when you use a sewing thread like this is the thread basically disappears into the fabric. It doesn't stand out. It's not designed to stand out in a construction or a seaming or a top stitching effect. It's designed to kind of just blend into the fabric. Whereas if you sew the same top stitch or exposed seam stitch, or like a lap seam or something on a side of a pair of slacks or something like that, you will see the polyester embroidery thread. It will stand out. We might have a close look at this pink fabric that I've got here, and I've just run two rows of stitches. This one here is using the Resant, and you can hardly even see it. And even though the polyester thread is a really close match to this color, the minute we lay it down on the fabric, the luster just jumps out of the fabric, and that's what it's designed to do. So you can see the seam stitch here is really, really exposed, or this top stitch is really exposed and really jumping out of the fabric. And I couldn't get a closer match than that thread. So I guess it's the reflection of the light that actually reflects off that Trilobal polyester and makes the thread stand out. Now, if you're happy with that effect, use the thread. If you want to use it as a seaming thread or a construction thread or a top stitching thread, and that effect is great for you, absolutely perfect. Go ahead and use it. So that's one of the key differences. What about the strength of the seam? Well, I've been doing some scientific testing. I can't get any actual numbers that are perfect, but I have this little force gauge here that measures up to about 2 kilograms of force. And I've run a series of tests, and I don't need to bore you with that. It's not that scientific, but it does give you a bit of an indication. Testing the strength or the amount of force it takes to break a 12-inch or snap a 12-inch piece of this thread, the Resant thread, as opposed to a 12-inch length of the polyester embroidery thread, ranged, and I did about five tests on each thread ranged between about 600 grams and 700 grams of force for both. There was very little difference. The tensile strength on both those threads is very much the same. Now, polyester thread in embroidery will also tend to, under extreme load, stretch a little bit more than a spun polyester or a spun polyester cotton core spun thread. So there is a tendency for an embroidery thread to have a little bit more stretch and give. That can lead to a little bit of puckering on light fabric. So as long as you know what you're getting into when you move forward with that thread, that's fine as well. But that's a few of the fundamental differences is the sheen of the thread. If you're happy with that jumping out at you on the fabric, if you're happy with that little bit extra stretch that might be in the thread, depending on how your machine's set up, and a tiny little bit of puckering can develop from that on light fabrics, as long as you know that going into it. As far as wearability though, the polyester embroidery thread is going to have great wear. It's got, it's color fast. That's a big advantage on polyester embroidery thread, 100% color fast, and it'll last a long time. But it is definitely an okay thing to use pretty much any good quality polyester embroidery thread as a seaming or construction thread. Would I use it if it's the only thread I've got and I don't have a matching color? Sure, absolutely. But I tend to like the approach of on the exposed seams and exposed stitching of the matte finish on the spun thread, in this case Resant, to give you that really low-key, not standing out seaming and construction. We've also got this other little one, totally different color thread. Same deal though. That's the closest matched thread I could get to between the Hemingworth poly and the Resant cotton core spun thread that I've got. They are quite the same shades, but the vibrancy and the trilobal nature of the polyester means it just shines, and a large part of that is the reflection of the light. I mentioned that on the pink stuff here. It's the light reflects off it, so the thread is going to be much more visible. And again, looking at this seam here, this is the Resant right there, and just across here is the polyester embroidery thread. You can see it just stands out. You might like that look, and that's okay. If you don't like that look, don't use a polyester embroidery thread. So I could talk for hours about threads and how they're constructed and why you would use this and that, but you don't need to get too involved in it. You just need to know the answer to the question is yes, if you like the finish, you can use polyester embroidery thread. Hemingworth in particular, the strength is there, and but any of the good quality brands of poly embroidery thread will do the same thing. So I hope that clarifies it. We've had loads of questions on that topic over the last few weeks, and hopefully that helps. So cheers for now. Bye.